I just picked up a new addition to my role-playing game collection, and it's called the Basic Fantasy Role-Playing Game. And this is the soft cover. I picked it up from Amazon, $5. Yeah, Amazon Prime, free shipping, so $5, and that's it. And you can actually download this whole thing in PDF for free. I also picked up an adventure anthology, and it's a collection of dungeons. So this is essentially Dungeons and Dragons. They'll say otherwise for reasons I'll get into. But it's part of what's called the OSR, or the Old School Renaissance. So Dungeons and Dragons has had a number of rule sets over the years. When I started back in the late 70s, and I honestly don't remember. It's been so long, and I didn't have any materials myself. I had my pen and paper, and I had to borrow dice. I probably started with what was called the White Book, and it was one of the very earliest of the Dungeons and Dragons published games. And it was a series of little white pamphlets. And this grew out of the old sand table wargaming, and they added in magic and dragons and so on and so forth, and eventually dungeons and so on. And Dave Arneson, Gary Gygax, and others came up with this Dungeons and Dragons game. Well, the original white box set was virtually impossible to learn from. It was more of a reminder for people who already knew how to play the game. My Dungeon Master course walked us through it, and so we played with him. And this was for a little while. Later on, I started buying my own materials, and so did the rest of my group. And it's funny. So I lived at the time, I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we couldn't find the stuff in Santa Fe. This is, of course, pre-internet and so on. So if somebody didn't have it in stock, you had to try mail order. And this sort of the D&D stuff was not popular. It was virtually unknown at the time. So even going mail order or whatever would be very difficult to locate. Now I found a couple of sources down in Albuquerque, and my grandmother lived in Albuquerque, an hour's drive. We were down there frequently, so I picked up my own stuff down in Albuquerque. One of the places was called War Games West, and it was down on Central, and they had most of the stuff. There was another place that I just absolutely loved, and it was called Wooden Horse Hobbies. It was right up the road from where my grandmother lived, and they actually had a better selection of at the time Dungeons and Dragons stuff than War Games West did. So I was able to pick up a few things. But so they started out with a white box. When I went to pick up my own set, I went into this Wooden Horse Hobbies, and they had two separate sets. They had the white box, which is a set of little booklets, and they also had at the time the brand new basic set. Dungeons and Dragons basic set. It's also the rule booklet is blue, and a gentleman named Holmes was the one that developed it. Now, because the white box set was so difficult to try and learn from, he put together a set of rules that was a little easier to follow, and a lot easier to follow for that matter. And it was, again, basically the white box rules, updated a few things, but Gygax was still working on the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons at that point. So this is a slightly different set of rules, and that's what I started with originally. They went up to level 3 or so. Anyway, but that was the first one I got. Then the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was released. They changed the rules considerably, moving from one to the other. They cleaned things up, made it easier to follow, but it also started to become more complicated. And the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is generally called the first edition at this point, as of now. Now, at the same time that the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was coming out, they re-released the basic set with a slightly updated set of rules, cleaned up, updated, and so on, much easier to follow. And this is the red box. I think it's Mulvey developed it. It's called the Mulvey set. But anyway, this is the red box that so many of the guys started with. And this was a different set of rules than the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but it was available at the same time. Now I ran games in the original basic, the home set. I ran games in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and my brother had a friend that wanted me to DM for them, and so I would come and DM, and he had the basic, and then later the expert set, and they went together. But it was essentially a parallel set of rules to the Advanced D&D. Later on, they came up with a second edition. I think I DM'd one game with the second edition somebody had. Didn't care for it, but mostly it was just I was used to the AD&D. That's what I've been playing for so long. So but again, it was a different rule set. Third edition came along. I wasn't even aware of that at the time. It had some issues, so they came out with a 3.5. They cleaned up a lot of stuff, made massive changes to it. The way the game is played is pretty much the same, but the rule sets were getting more and more complicated, harder and harder to follow. And I do have, as a matter of fact, because then they came out with the fourth edition, and some people like it, a lot of people don't. It was radically different from what they've been doing previously. It had a completely different feel to it as a game. And most people I know didn't care for it. Again, I hadn't played it personally. So Paizo Publishing came out with their version of the 3.5 rules. which they call Pathfinder, and I did pick up that, and I like it a lot. But it is, again, on the complicated side, and it is different from the original stuff that we were playing. They have since come out with the 5th edition, where they, again, changed it, made it a lot more flexible. They've gone back in some ways to the older rules, but it's a much easier game to pick up, much easier game to play. It's not nearly as rules heavy as some of the early ones, but like character creation and whatnot has become way more complex. People like it. I picked it up. It's kind of neat. But again, it's very, very different. So they've got guys that were either nostalgic over the old rule sets or just weren't interested in how heavy or complicated some of the newer sets were becoming. And so they started what's called this old school renaissance. And they're doing their own versions of older sets of Dungeons and Dragons rules. In some cases, they've taken off with them, really gone their own direction with them. Some cases, they're fairly true to the original sets. In almost all the cases, they're making them much easier to read, much easier to follow. So I've been sort of looking at the various OSR rules, and this one struck me, again, very inexpensive. But it's also gotten terrific reviews, especially from the guys of approximately my era and a little after, saying how much it reminded them of the originals that they started in. And the way they're able to do this, I think it's Wizards of the Coast, when they bought the Dungeons and Dragons stuff from TSR, and they'd moved on past 3.5. They went ahead and made virtually all the rule sets prior to 3.5 open source. So you can use them, you do whatever you want with them, you just can't use the name Dungeons and Dragons on it. And so they've got all these different names, all these different rule sets. But this is where the Renaissance is coming about. These guys are going back to the older rule sets, and it does have a completely different feel to it. And I've been thumbing through this, just got it yesterday, and I've been reading through it and going over it. And it reminds me so much of the stuff I started with. One of it's the art. It's all just sort of, fan art and stuff. It's not real professional or anything. It's like, hobbyists throwing it together and throwing this together. And it's already, I can tell it's easier to read than the original that I have, the original basic set. And this is based on the Red Box, the basic expert set, or BX is called a lot of times. But again, it's been cleaned up, organized a little better, changed, a few of the rules that had issues. And I can tell you, most of those early rule sets, you would have some serious issues. And you learn to either work around them using homebrew rules or whatever, use house rules. But you'd work around it. It never caused an issue to me where I found the game unplayable, although some people didn't care for them. But anyway, like I said, this harkens back to the old games when I was playing back in the day. And then I picked up Adventure Anthology, and it's got some little dungeons to run through with maps and so on. And again, it reminds me of the old days when it was all homebrew. I think I have 2 or 3 dungeons, quests, modules that I purchased. A couple of them came with the sets, but for the most part, I would homebrew. I'd go draw the maps out and figure out where everything was, and then when the guys would come over, I'd walk them through my dungeon, and they'd work their way through, and had a good old time. And this just so much reminds me of the old days. And for the expense, $5 for this, 3 and change for this. Geez, you can't hardly go wrong. And I've been going through it, and I really don't have to play it because it is so close to the old stuff that I was used to. It's just gonna be transferring over, and I'll have to go through it a little bit, see if there are any particular differences. But it's just all so familiar. It's like, yep. That's what I'm used to. But anyway, so I've dipped my toe into the OSR movement, the old school Renaissance movement. I picked up my first old school Renaissance game, and to be honest, I probably won't get any others. Although they've got a couple of them that are just very well done. But I've got the originals, and then I've got the newer stuff up through 5th edition. I've got Pathfinder, which sort of covers the 3.5. I'm not particularly interested in 4th edition, and like I said, 2nd edition I didn't much care for. But so I've got lots of materials. But this is kind of neat. It makes it, character creation is quick and easy. You go to the dungeons, they're quick and easy. It's easy to get killed off. I get a kick out of those of us who played back in the day are sort of used to it, and we understand the differences. People who have never played these older games, and again, it's 40 years or more now. So you've got a very large portion of the population who were not around when those older games were around, and they're used to the newer stuff. And when they start playing the older games, it's not quite what they're expecting. As I said, it was to us, it was much more like a complicated game of chess. The whole role-playing thing wasn't quite as emphasized. And you could get killed out. It was hard. And boy, you worked to get your first level character to survive to 2nd, 3rd, and then at 3rd, 4th level, it started becoming to my mind, fun. And my favorite levels were really 5th through about 8th, because that's when you start getting the really good monsters and stuff coming in, and that's when your guys halfway survivable. You get some good magic spells and so on. But that was those were my favorite levels. But it was fun, and your guy got killed out. It's like, oh well, if your fellows, your team, your crew, whatever, your party could manage to get you resurrected somehow, hey, great. But otherwise you just roll up a new character. It wasn't a big deal. And that's the other thing is, they recommend rolling the characters. The new ones, they recommend using a point system or a standard array or anything else. And for like tournament play or something like that, it really makes everybody very well balanced, and the rules are written towards more balanced characters and so forth. But in the old days, it was fun. You show up for the session, everybody would roll up their characters. And if you roll like straight 3s, it's like, oh, he's going to be a farmer. Bye-bye, and you'd roll a new one. That wasn't a big deal. But man, you'd roll bam, bam, bam. And it was funny because I rolled one guy, it was straight 17s, which is excellent. I mean, your scores for your various attributes are 3 to 18, 18 being the best. This guy was straight 17s. And I was so stoked. I was going to start this guy off as a fighter, and he was eventually going to go for different classes and become a bard. He got killed out like immediately. I had another guy that was a fighter. I rolled an 18, and at the time you'd roll your strength, and if you got an 18, you'd roll these percentages. And he was like an 1895, which is just insane. That's almost, best that you can get. He got killed out almost immediately. I was like, oh, man. But you just roll up a new one. And again, character creation was so fast for this. You roll them up, you buy your equipment, and you're ready to go. It wasn't that big deal. But, so this is my first foray into the OSR. And again, it's familiar. I mean, I've got the original rules. This one's just a very cleaned up version. And this is, again, closer to the BX series, BX edition rather than the original basic edition that I've got, which was, to be honest, kind of crude and it could be hard to follow. So this is going to be a lot better. So I've got my OSR game. I've got my OSR dice. I picked up dice from Chessex, the same colors as the original Holmes dice I got with my very first D&D set. And so I'm kind of excited to play with this a little bit and read through it and maybe put together a couple of games. But at least I got it in my collection now. And as I said, I've dipped my toe into the OSR movie.